Hello and welcome to the Novelty Live Show on Point of View and Tense. We're diving into a fun craft topic today and something that comes up whether you're a new writer or a seasoned writer, because every project you have to ask yourself, like, what point of view and what tense am I going to write this story in? So we have our Twitter app. You guys can ask us questions there with the hashtag novelty show, or in the YouTube chat, though sometimes it can move fast. So Twitter is a more guaranteed spot for us to see a question. But yeah, let's do some introductions and get into it. Hi, I'm Kat.
I'm Alexa.
And I'm Lainey.
All right, so let's start off by talking a little bit about there aren't really standards of like what point of view and what tense you should use, but there are kind of ones that you see most common for certain genres. Like for example, adult fantasy tends to be in third person, usually third person past tense. Whereas in young adult, you see a lot more first person and a lot more present tense. So I guess we can start with kind of just a basic overview of the points of views, first, second, and third. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about just the general basics?
Yeah, I mean, I can take first person, which is like the one I'm not really familiar with all that well. Well, first person is obviously you're pretty much the driver of the character. Like it feels very like it's you because they use the I pronoun throughout the entire novel. I find that one is the most difficult almost between first and third. Yeah, I feel like
we're gonna debate this. It's fine.
Yeah. At least for me, I feel like my security blanket tense is definitely going to be third person past tense. That's like what I'm most familiar with, but I'm trying to learn first person because one of the projects that I'm drafting, I'm like, I'm going to try first person with this one and see how it goes. And it took me like several chapters to really get the feel of it and to get the right kind of pattern and emotion with it.
Right. What made you decide to do first person if third is your comfort? It was just like better for the project?
Kind of, because I knew I only wanted one character, which I typically write multi-POV. So I feel like with multi-POV, it's definitely easier to do third person to distinguish voice. But I wanted to do a lot of different things with this project I was drafting. So a lot of my stories are journey based. So I'm like, this is going to take place in one location. I'm going to do first person because I've never done that before. And it's going to be, well, it's still going to be past tense. I don't think I'm good enough right now to write present tense because it's so difficult.
I see. For me, first person present is like my comfort. Like,
oh, really?
I used to hate first person. It wasn't until like, I mean, I guess it was a long time ago now, but like the Hunger Games and like that dystopian wave when I started seeing first person present tense, that I was like, oh, I like this now. Like at first, before that, I used to like intentionally not read books that were first person present. Like that would be a deal breaker for me.
A lot of people still feel that way. Like you see that a lot when this conversation comes up. They say, I won't even look at a book that's in first person. I'm like, wow, you must ignore entire categories. Which is fine.
You're missing out on some really great stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Hunger Games. I feel the same way. Kat, I used to hate, not first person itself, but I didn't like first person present. And the Hunger Games is the book that changed my mind. Yeah. And I think it's until you see someone who has a mastery of it to go, oh, if I work harder, maybe this could work. I'm writing my first book in first person present right now, and it's really hard. And we can talk a bit more about like how we choose and then kind of like some of the challenges of each of them.
That's kind of interesting that we're talking about this because I just realized I don't ever really care if I'm reading tenses that I'm not familiar with. Like when I open up a book and it's like first person present tense, I'm like, okay, here we go. And I just keep reading. Like I I'm never turned off by any POV or any tense that they use.
Oh, really, Lainey? Because we haven't talked
Yeah.
about second person yet, which is next. And I will take this one because I hate it. I hate it so much. It's really rare for a reason. Second tense is when the whole thing is like, you do this, you do that. Don't like it. I am willing to concede it can be effective as a literary device in certain cases. I just really don't want to read it. I DNF'd a book 2 weeks ago because I didn't know it was going to be in second person. And first page, I was like, no, what is this? No, I was really upset.
I mean, it's such a rare thing. Like, I can name maybe a handful.
It's polarizing. It's a very polarizing tense.
But yeah, it can have that impact. It has a lot of the same pros as first person does, and that it's very immediate and it's very like it grabs you and like immerses you into that narration. Except
it's passive in a way, and there's distance in it. There's distance in it compared to first person. I guess my thing with it is it's almost like an instructional manual.
Interesting.
And I'm just like, I'm not here for it. The book in question, to give it credit, not for me, the character is a robot. I understand the choice. I just find it so awkward to read, personally.
I mean, I think I've only read like one book that was in second tense or second person, which I was like fine with. Like, it's fine reading, but I'm not like looking up like, ooh, what's some more second tense books I can read?
Yeah, I don't think I've read any. Like, I know of a few that I've been like kind of interested in, but I think the second tense does tend to be so foreign. Like, I feel like, maybe if it was more common and I got used to it, kind of like how I got used to first person present tense, like that took me a while to warm up to. But yeah, I can't really think of many second person books.
I think because it's really hard to do well.
Yeah,
that's the thing. And it's hard to do for a sustained novel. Like, you might see it more in short stories
or just as one POV in a multi-POV book.
Right. And
in fairness, maybe I can stomach that, but not the lead character. Sorry.
But yeah, and then we have third person, which for a long time was like the standard in literature. This is why so many classics are written in third person. And this is he, she, they. And it can be limited to one character and be like very close in one character's head throughout the story, kind of like Harry Potter. We'll get the occasional like bookend chapters that are from a different character's perspective, in the later books at least. But for the most part, we stay with Harry. We are just with Harry. And then there are also omniscient narrators where it's like a detached narrator from the situation who's kind of telling you about the story a bit more from a distance. Philip Pullman does this a lot. Neil Gaiman is also really good at this. This is any kind of story where you get the narrator sort of foreshadowing something that will happen. Like, little did he know is a very omniscient narrator type of thing. Let's talk a little bit about tense, because like tense and point of view go so hand in hand. In
fact, we keep saying, like, we were saying second tense, we meant second person. I did it. I started that train, actually. I think it was me. Second person and then present or past tense. Different.
Yeah, that's right. But I feel like present tense is so closely related to first person, probably because we don't see it a lot in third person.
It's rare.
Third person present is rare. It can be done really well. Like The Night Circus is one famous example. But generally, third person present tends to read more like a screenplay, because that's how screenplays are written in third person present. And so, yeah, I always just really strongly associate present tense with first person, and then past tense really can go either way.
Mm-hmm.
And really, like, the standards, like third person past is a standard. It's a major standard. And then I think first person past is the other standard, with some preference for first person present, specifically in YA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, and the funny thing is, some of my favorite books, like when I was thinking of examples for each of these combinations of like first present, first past, some of them I had to actually go look at my books because I can't remember, like, were they first person present or first person past? And I think that's a good mark of them just being done well, that you don't notice it. It doesn't stand out. But like the Percy Jackson books are first person past tense, but they still feel so immediate, and you feel so like in the moment with them, even though they're narrated in past tense, but they're first person. So it's,
yeah. And I feel like first person isn't necessarily a standard in middle grade, which kind of makes it stand out. I feel like third person's very common in middle grade. It's that storytelling feel that you get from it.
Yeah.
So let's dig a bit more into first person. So we'll kind of dig into the specifics, pros and cons of each one, and then we'll talk about how the heck do you choose? How do you choose what to do? So we've already kind of talked about it, but like one of the reasons I love first person as a reader, as a writer, but particularly honestly as a reader, is the immediacy. I like that you're right in their head, and it's like you're an intimacy. You get all of those emotions and feelings like firsthand, and it's like you're, I don't know, like it's like they're a robot and you climbed into their bodysuit and you're experiencing the story. That's so creepy. Yeah. Don't skin people. It's fine.
Yeah, no, it really it feels like you're the one doing it, because you're reading that in your brain. You're like, I do this, I do that. So it is very immersive, and you do get very close to the narrator's thoughts and feelings. Like everything is like really filtered through their lens. Whereas with third person, you do have a little bit of distance there. So, if you pause in the middle of some action to describe something in third person, that kind of feels a little more natural than like if the first person perspective is in the middle of action and then they pause to describe something, like that can kind of feel a little bit off sometimes.
Well, and I think that's why it does work so well in YA, and thriller is another genre where you see it a lot, because they are fast-paced, usually action-driven books, meaning it really benefits the narrative that you're in their head and you're not navel gazing, chewing scenery, etc. It can really be a benefit of first person in those specific categories. It suits the reading experience.
Yeah, I think it can also be, if we're talking a little bit about cons.
Let's do it.
I
find it impossible not to talk about cons when you're talking about pros, personally.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this just now, and I'm like, it's really hard to get a feel for other characters sometimes in first person, because you're only seeing them through the eyes of the first person narrator. So it's sometimes very hard to describe other characters to get the real idea of what those secondary supporting characters are, because we're only getting it from the narrator, how they feel about them.
It's true.
And sometimes this is a common mistake that I see in some books of first person, is they're trying to describe what other characters are thinking or feeling without actually knowing it. It's like a slip of them being like, oh, he thinks I'm wrong, but you don't know that's what he's thinking. Like how did you suddenly become psychic and know that he is for sure thinking that? You have to, it lends into show versus tell. Like it's the first person narrator telling what their interpretation of this person's reaction is, but you have to give the reader the reaction. Like he raised his eyebrow skeptically to imply that like he thinks you're wrong, instead of just.
But even there, you're applying a filter to it, because the POV character assumes it's skeptical. Pros and cons to that. First of all, lots of filtering. I have problems with filtering when I write in first person, partly for this reason, because you're literally filtering the entire book through someone's point of view. But what's nice is you can actually misdirect the reader because of this, which you can use to your advantage. Meaning, if you have your POV first person character assume something, doesn't mean it's true, which I kind of like. You can do reversals, especially when it comes to bad guys.
And romance too, that's great. Like the character will like do something and they'll interpret it as like, oh, they don't like me. But you, the reader, like, no, they clearly like you. Like it's just intention.
And also then it kind of becomes really important who you choose as your first person narrator, because I think it's why most often we don't have unobservant POV narrators in first person novels. They have to be somewhat perceptive or the author is screwed. They have to be able to make suppositions about things, or else you're deprived of showing anything else. But I would agree that's an inherent problem, though I think you get it in third person limited as well. It's both a pro and a con to anything where you're limiting a POV. Like, for example, Harry Potter's third person limited, and you still have the problem of every character is filtered through Harry's point of view, and sometimes he's wrong. So you can still have it in third person, pros, for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then another kind of a con of first person is that it can lessen tension in some scenes, because you can assume that the first person narrator is going to survive that situation. If it's the middle of the book and some big tense battle scene is going down, they're probably not going to die if it's first person present or first person past in most situations. So that can lessen tension a little bit.
But you can increase tension with an unreliable narrator. It's a nice pro of first person. Though I guess the catch there is you got to be real. Well, I think you have to be really skilled to pull off very artful and masterful first person for that reason. Because there are things you can do with it, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and it's a delicate balance of also, you can't get away as much as you can in third person with keeping things that a character knows from the reader.
Yes. And I hate that cheat too.
Yeah, but in third person, if it's limited, then it's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah.
But you can get away with it a little bit better in third person if one narrating character knows something that the reader isn't supposed to know.
Yeah.
And that lays into the whole unreliable narrator thing.
Right. I'm sure there's more pros and cons to first person, but we can come around to them by talking about the other ones.
Mm-hmm. Third person.
Third person. I love third person, and yet have not written a publishable book in third person. Someday.
I like third person too. It's also a big factor is it's what I grew up with,
Mm-hmm.
First person really came into popularity in the last 15 or so years with the emergence of contemporary YA, by which I mean the contemporary YA market, not just non-speculative YA.
Yeah, I grew up writing third person past because I used to do online role playing on forums. And the standard rule for those was always third person past when you're writing with other people.
So that's just
so that's just what I've come used to. That's what my background is. That's the one I'm most comfortable writing in. So I think that's why I used those ones in my first few books that I wrote, because that's just what I'm used to.
Okay. So third person it can be a little more versatile. And that you have more leeway with, holding information from the reader. It's usually a better choice when you have multiple narrators so that their voices can be a little bit more distinct. Because when you have two first-person narrators, sometimes those voices can really blend together.
Yeah, we're not going to call out books, but we can all think of one, and it might be the same one. There's at least one famous one I can think of that I was so frustrated the whole time. I could not tell the POVs apart, and I was so annoyed.
Does the book start with an A?
It does.
Okay, I think it is the one I'm thinking too.
First person is hard, and I really think people underestimate that. And I actually think this leads to a lot of the misconception that you get, meaning there's some snobbery that you get where people are like, I don't like first person, I only like third person. And third person's great. I love third person. But I think part of that is people think first person rather, is easier in the sense that you can just vomit out something in first person and it's fine. You don't have to do extra work on it. And we do see lazy first person books in YA. Love my category, but let's be real, you do. And I think it gives it a bad rap for every amazing, masterful, skillful application of first person, there are lazy ones. And I think they really feed into the misconception. And one of the big ones is like, very few authors can pull off multi-POV in first person and do it well. It's really hard.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
So that's a pro of third person.
Yeah.
So I like to jump around.
Another pro is that you have, a bit of distance from the character. It can give you a bit of a grander scope. If you're not entirely in their head, you're not super close to them, you take a step back, you can just see a little bit more, and just that distance lets you sort of read into other characters a little bit more. Like, everything is still generally filtered through your main character's perspective, but you're not so close in their head that like their word is law.
Yeah, I love it for world building. Third person, there's something about description and observing the landscape that you can do in third person, even third person limited, without it feeling awkward to the reader. Because in first person, you really are limited by that POV narrator, and it'll be like, why is this POV narrator staring at the landscape for 3 paragraphs talking about the sunset or whatever it is? And I like that in third, because it makes things feel, or at least I feel in my own writing, I'm more vivid. My writing is more vivid in third. So I really should write a book in third person. I love third person.
You can kind of get away with more flowery descriptions than the narrator would actually say in dialogue. Especially in YA, you have, teenagers who might speak more casually, but you can get away with sort of more beautiful prose descriptions that, it would feel a little bit weird if the character was like monologuing it. But because it's only like kind of filtered through their perspective by what they're focused on and like what they're taking in, you can play around with language more. And Alexa, like you said, get a little more vivid.
It's grander, but that's actually also the thing that can lead to more distance. Distance from the internalness of your main character. So it's the pros and cons again. Because I do think it's worth talking about with third person, as great as it is, that if you're writing in certain categories, you likely will get pushback from agents, editors, and readers if you write in third person when first person is the standard. And what you're going to hear a lot is, I just couldn't connect. And very often that's because of the inherent distance in third person. And the challenge there is, just like first person, actually, being really good at third person limited, like knocking out of the park, is, I think, harder than people think. Third person is just like first, can feel deceptively easy.
I think it's kind of the flip to, first person done poorly can read kind of like stream of conscious word vomit, like kind of lazy. Third person done poorly can read as kind of bland and boring because you are so detached from.
Like, why do I care?
Yeah. It's like too much distance there that you're like, I don't care about this person. I'm not connected at all.
Yeah, I also feel like third person is harder to nail distinctive voices than first person. Because I feel like with my first person book that I'm writing right now, I'm like, oh, this voice is so much easier to distinguish than my voices in third person are.
Yeah, I definitely think in many ways it's easier to be super voicey in first. So it's just like there's more work that you have to do in third. Really, no matter what you choose, you're going to have to do a lot of work. and that, therefore, I think it really comes down to choosing the right one for the story.
Right.
And it really is a book by book decision, and also an author decision. Some authors are just more naturally comfortable in one over the other, but I think that anyone can teach themselves, so to speak, how to write one over the other if you want.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about other narrative structures that blend first and third, or present and past, and kind of like get a little bit unusual. Like I've seen some books that are like mostly in first person. I'm thinking of specifically a YA thriller that I read that was mostly in first person. But then like every few chapters, there was a third person chapter from the point of view of like the nameless villain. And that was just kind of to add tension and to like give us the glimpse of like what this villain was doing. And it was like a detached third person, when the rest of the story wasn't very close first person.
I've seen that in thrillers too. Actually.
That happens. That exact like setup also happens a lot in romance novels. Like you'll get the female main character usually has the first person POV, and then if it is dual perspective, sometimes the guy or the love interest is always the third person, so it's like more detached, and you don't really know.
That's to keep the tension up.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'd blow surprises. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I guess same thing in a thriller. So to that end, you can use mixing both if you're skilled at it to build tension, increase tension while still, it's like having your cake and eating it too, because you get to reveal information not from the first person POV perspective.
And information that they don't have. So yeah, you get your dramatic tension where the audience is like clued in on something and your first person narrator is not. You're kind of just like stepping over that con of first person perspective where like the main character doesn't know things.
Yeah.
I've also seen this done in a couple of contemporary stories, like Nicola Yoon's The Sun is Also a Star and Adam Silvera's They Both Die at the End. Both of those books are dual point of view from two main characters told in first person. But then like there are random chapters in between that are told in third person present tense from other like miscellaneous side characters just to add like scope and more depth to the world. And, another glimpse into a scene that our two main characters were a part of. And here the reader gets a glimpse into what this other character that was in that scene like was experiencing, which I think is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read a thriller recently. I don't know if I liked it, but it did this, where there was a first-person perspective from the female character, and then third person from the perspective, so like third limited of the male, and they were meant to be kind of juxtaposed to work for a twist, which I won't blow. And honestly, I don't know if I liked it. I understand what it was doing, but I'm still kind of mad about it because it felt like cheating.
Yeah.
So, meaning I'd say like be wary of being so fancy with mixing POVs that you annoy your readers, because that can happen too. Don't be too clever.
And also, I haven't read this book, but N.K. Jemisin, I believe, her book, she does like different points of views for different characters, and one of them is actually told in second person. So I don't even know what the other perspectives are. I just remember hearing like one was told in second person, and I was like, oh, that's unusual. But yeah, so like multiple narrators, but they have different points of view.
You know, it'd be interesting. I don't read a lot of books that do a lot of mixing of POVs like that, but that'd be fun to read because the author is doing those POVs tenses intentionally, and it makes you wonder why is that.
That's what annoyed me, honestly, with the one I read. I knew there was trickery afoot, and I didn't know what it was.
But that can be fun as like a reader. Like that's
Yeah, was that your author brain trying to like analyze it too much?
I don't know. It's going in my next wrap up. I'm gonna talk about all my feelings. I hate read most of the book, but ultimately I liked it.
Okay.
I found the convention so annoying, but I kept reading because I knew that something was up.
Right.
Still
and then we also have expository novels, which are novels told in the form of like letters, articles, interviews, things like that. One that a lot of people have read recently, which I think would fall under this, maybe Daisy Jones and the Six, which is told entirely in interviews, and like it's lots of different characters recalling things that happened to them. And then the Illuminate series is a big one in YA, which is told also in interviews, but also like articles and from like messages the characters sent to each other. And it's like pieced together from all these different sources.
Though, I mean, as long as we're talking about pros and cons of things, I have to say, when you break format like that, when you do, like, since we're talking about distance a lot, I find that really distancing. And I think that as an author, you have to be kind of aware of that, because No One Murder Me, Please. I personally did not love Illuminae. I felt super distanced from everything. And I didn't really care.
See, okay, that was like the first book that I've read that was kind of like that. So overall, I enjoyed it, but I also felt very distanced. I'm like, but where are the feelings?
I enjoyed it. I just didn't care. And in fact, I actively wanted one of them to die because I found them that annoying.
Oh no.
Yeah, don't come for me. It's fine.
See, I felt like the emotions of the characters in the second book were better than the first. I do remember feeling that way.
I haven't read the third book yet because I do so emotionally detached from it that it's hard to like get into it again. Yeah. But I did just enjoy the sort of novelty of the book so much. I was like, oh, this is really thing. And like, I found it really engaging, even though distance was definitely a problem with the two main characters. But it was a lot of like action and cool sci-fi stuff going on. It wasn't a huge like internal emotional story.
Yeah.
And then just related to that, because epistolary books kind of fall under that expository one, those can feel awkward. Not distancing, just awkward. So now we're getting into experimental formats of writing. But I think that it all does wrap up with tense and POV, because you make choices within that. And actually, second person can sometimes slot into that. Like if someone's writing a letter to someone, you could work that in. But I think it's kind of...
But that's like perks of being a wallflower, where he's like writing the letters to someone in particular, and like they're narrated like I'm writing to you because of this kind of thing.
I think so. I have a friend who wrote an epistolary novel that was mostly in second person, so yeah.
Okay, so now that we've done our big run through of all the points of views and tenses and whatnot, how do we choose? How do you make a decision?
I feel like I don't make decisions. Like with my first 3 books, it was all third person pass because that's what I'm most used to. I didn't really think of it much beyond that. I mean, one of the books I did drop all the POVs except for one, but I'm always scared that someone's gonna be like, you should rewrite this in first person, because I don't want to do that huge of a rewrite. Rewrite the book from scratch, then have to change like the POV tense and stuff. But I was more deliberate with this book that I am drafting right now, because I finally recognized, hey, I've been writing all these books in third person pass. Let's like do a little bit of an experiment for myself, and let's do this one in first. So that's why I kind of chose that one.
Yeah. It does kind of come naturally to me as well. Though I have on some books in the past taken the first chapter, not the whole chapter necessarily, but a few pages, and I've written it from multiple POVs and tenses to see which one read the best, and then decided. I did that with Brightly Burning for sure. But like this new one, the thriller, first person present just happened. I started writing the first chapter and that's what came out. And I was like, okay, it just felt organic. But it makes sense for the genre. So maybe that's why it felt organic. And then I do have a YA fantasy that I've started. And that third person pass just happened. It was like, this feels right. So, and part of that is just reading a lot, like really being familiar with stories and like conventions and like POVs and tenses and what feels right. And then when you conceive of your story, I think certain things just happen naturally.
Yeah, there are kind of, there's no hard and fast rules, but there are kind of standards for the different genres and different categories. And also factors like, is the book more like character driven? Is it more focused on like internal plot and thoughts and feelings, or is it more focused on external plot and action? Because then you have to weigh the pros and cons of like, okay, well, first person is better for emotional and like really close to the character kind of stories. For my books, I think it was kind of organic for me as well in most situations. And now that I think back on it, it is mostly because of the genre standards. Like I wrote a young adult paranormal fantasy that was in first person past tense. I wrote a kind of an upper middle grade story that was in third person past tense because that felt like just the right one to do for like that grander storytelling scope. I do have one story that has given me so much trouble, and if I ever do revisit it, I have to figure out what point of view and what tense it's going to be, because I've tried multiple and I still don't know what it should be, if it should be third person or first person, and if first person past or present. So I think I initially wrote it in first person present because that was my like a comfort zone, but I don't know. I still don't know what it's going to be.
And I think sometimes it's definitely worth experimenting. It's like Lainey, like you're doing. It's worth saying, well, this is my comfort zone. I'm going to try something else.
Yeah.
I just desperately want to write a novel in third person so badly. It just keeps not happening.
It sounds like you love it so much.
I do.
First.
It makes, but for like my thriller, it makes no sense. It wouldn't work. So.
Have you guys ever had to switch and like rewrite? Like Alexa, you just mentioned doing like one chapter in each sort of to experiment, but have you ever had
I did that so I'd never face the heartbreak of having to rewrite an entire book.
Yeah, I think I might have to do a full rewrite for that one tricky project.
I know people who have done it. It is not pleasant.
No,
I don't want to do it.
And what some people don't realize is that it's not as simple as just changing like the
it changes everything.
Like it changes everything. The whole story is filtered differently.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I do my experimental first chapters, because I get a feel for what's going to accomplish what I want to accomplish with the book. So like with my fantasy, I definitely did the test with the fantasy where I wrote the first scene from first person and from third person. And I just liked in third person that it was the grandiosity. I liked kind of the scale and the tone and the way I was able to really chew on my scenery a bit in a way that in first person wouldn't make sense. And that particular book is all about kind of like grandiosity and chewing scenery. So I was like, third person makes sense here.
Right.
Yeah, I never had to. I hope I never have to. Like, I get hives at thinking of having to change that. Because like I always like read blog posts from like people who are in like pitch wars or author mentor match, and they're like, I changed from like third person to first person, and I'm like, I can't do that.
That's writing the entire book.
And I do want to speak to that, and this isn't to knock anyone in pitch wars or author mentor match. Or agents. I've heard some agents do this too. I do want to caution people. This is really a third person thing, actually. And I think that actually does happen in YA a lot, Lainey, where someone reads a third person book and it's missing something and they can't put their finger exactly on what it is. They just know that there was distance, right? They didn't connect to it the way they wanted it to. And they'll say to the writer, change it to first person. And I actually think that's a cop-out. I think that shouldn't be your first port of call when you feel like something isn't working.
It is very close in third person. Like,
to me, that says the third person needs more work. To me, it says you have to go deeper. Like third person limited, there are levels to it. You can go really deep or less deep. And or it could be like Lainey, you were talking about developing the voice in third is a different challenge from in first. Well, so maybe it means you have to work to develop the voice more. Maybe it's actually the voice that is missing. It's not that it's not deep enough. It's that there's a spark missing in the book. And I'm always wary when someone's first suggestion is that you change the POV, because that is an intense edit and it changes the entire book because you are filtering differently. And I like to help authors avoid that pain if possible. But also because I believe that any skilled writer can make a POV and a tense work for them if they do the work. Completely changing it should be your last resort. And sometimes it does fix the problem, but it's writing a new book essentially. oh, that's painful. No. So just I say if someone's first suggestion to you is to rewrite your entire book from like third to first, really consider that feedback before you throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right. Again, because like I've had to go back at books on my shelf and be like, was that in third person or first? Because I genuinely like couldn't remember.
Yeah.
And that's just a test. And in some of the cases, it was in third person, and I was like, I swore this was in first person because I felt so.
Yep. I thought Libba Bray's books were first person. They are not.
Right.
They're third person, and I felt super close. So she's very talented. Yep.
I don't think I remember any books that I read that are in first or third person. I'd
But
actually
Lane,
have
you
to
read
go and
YA,
look.
so a ton of them are.
Yeah, I know.
A ton.
When I was looking up examples earlier, like The Fault in Our Stars, I could have sworn that was first person present tense, but it's past tense.
Mm.
I think another factor in helping you choose is thinking about comp titles for your book, and what point of view and tense those stories are told in, just to give you kind of an idea of like what the quote unquote standard is for like the genre and the type of book that you're writing in. So that could be one factor to help you make a decision on choosing point of view and tense. Also narrators, how many narrators you have, and I guess just what feels right for your specific narrator if you want to get really close into their head. Yeah.
And I actually think that's worth talking about, and like really good timing, because Pericula, I hope I pronounced that right, has a question about our thoughts on multiple POVs. And that's actually a good question to ask yourself. It kind of ties into POV and tense. Just deciding to write more than one POV is a really important choice, and can really impact your story. So I think we've all written multi-POV. So we I'm sure we have thoughts on this.
Oh, most of my books have been single point of view, but with my current project, it's a romance, and there's also external plot going on that both characters are very involved in. And I was like, they both need to be narrators. Like it started off as just one character story because I tend to gravitate towards single points of view. Those are easier, I feel. And after, like in the early outlining stages, even in the first few days of like tackling this project, I was like, okay, no, it needs to be two perspectives. Like this is two equal narrators. We're doing alternating points of view. So yeah, it was a tricky decision because it's my first like dual point of view project, so I don't have like a ton of confidence, but I'm working it out. We're getting there.
Yeah, I would say with my first book, well, my very first book was actually just a single POV, but my second book that I wrote was multi-POV four that I dropped down to one. And that was because I realized that the other three, it wasn't their true story. Like it was definitely the strongest, that people always said she was the strongest voice, and it really felt like it was her story to tell. So that was like the decision in rewriting that one with just one POV. But right now for the other book that I'm revising, my other YA fantasy, they're 3 POV. And like when I wrote it, I'm like, there's a good chance someone's gonna be like, you should drop all these but one. And that's what I was scared about. But thankfully, this is actually my author mentor match book. My mentor really liked all 3, but she said you need to really work on the stories of them. Like this is also their story to tell, but why? So that's like really what I'm working on in this revision, is giving each individual POV really fleshed out backstories and wants, I guess. Like this is like
They need arcs.
part of like this
arc.
is like it's there, but it's not there yet. So that's like what I've been really working on in that revision. And it feels like this is all 3 of their story into one, versus the other book it really did not feel that way. So I feel better about this one because I really feel like this is a 3 POV story, which it wasn't in the last one. So yeah.
And that speaks to, so my navel gazing thoughts on POVs, multi POVs. I think it's harder than people think it is. Every POV has to do work to the larger story, but there has to be an individual story as well. Differentiating voice is also a challenge that you need to work on. And it changes the scope of your story. And kind of reveals of information and tension and suspense. So it's an important choice. And often the POV, and not so much tense, the POV you prefer writing in can definitely inform that. If you love writing in first, generally that means no multi or dual POV, partly because it's harder, but partly because it's not as much a convention of that POV of first person. But with third person, I say just make sure that each POV, whether it's dual or multi, is actually earns its own story, essentially, is actually necessary. Because very often I think it is the case where you discover writing, oh, I really only have one strong POV here, it should be single, or you work hard and you make all of them count, essentially.
Yeah.
I love dual POV personally. I think it's great for romance, specifically.
I also think, I was just thinking this, I think your internal plot of each character needs to feed into the external plot.
Yeah.
Because it is with this current project that I'm working on, but my last project, not all the internal stories and character arcs were fitting into the overall external plot of the story.
Right. Really related to this, there's a question from Kenny who asks, speaking of multiple point of view, is it okay if not all characters get an equal amount of attention because certain characters have slightly bigger roles than others? And I'm going to say yes, but like Alexa was saying, like you have to make sure they all count.
Yeah. And it depends on the book and the genre.
One book that I love, Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, I believe there's like 7 or 9 characters who have narrating chapters. And most of them are told through either Simon or Baz, the 2 main characters. But there are a lot of smaller chapters that are told from other side characters in the story. And, they obviously don't get as much page time as the 2 main characters, but their chapters and their perspectives add to the story in a way that we need to see.
And it's a genre convention thing largely, so you can get away with that in fantasy because it is a convention of the genre. Like the readers will accept it. Oh, we're just dipping into the POV of this side person like a little. They're not the dominant main character. Totally cool. That's gonna feel really weird in a YA contemporary. I mean, having multiple POVs in a YA contemporary, unless it's dual, feels weird. And that's the thing. Like when you have dual, you usually need pretty even balance is the standard. So it depends on what you're writing.
Right.
And you do have to be careful with your balance, because what you don't want to have happen is it sucks when a reader where there's multi POVs and one of them is just really annoying or they think it's useless. And when they're reading those chapters, they are breezing through them because they just want to get back to the one that they actually like. So when you're like sending that kind of work to beta readers, it's like ask them questions about like, what parts did you skim? Because you may discover you don't need every POV necessarily.
Well, I've heard people say things like this about George R.R. Martin's books. Like there'll be whole characters, like they don't care about Dany's storyline or Cersei's story, like they just straight up skip all those chapters because they don't care about them.
Yeah.
But all of them are important to the overall story. It's just they aren't connecting with those characters.
And actually kind of related, Hannah Montana asked about if you try to write in one POV, you miss out on a lot of the story. And do we have tips on how to get everything into one POV? And I write a lot in one POV. You too, Kat. My thing is that if you've chosen one POV, it's for a specific reason. You actually want to limit the information, and it's a conscious choice. And then it actually provides a kind of fun writing challenge almost, where it's like, okay, I need this to happen, but I'm limited by the POV of my one character. And then it's almost like a writing experience. So meaning if you're feeling limited by one POV, maybe don't write one POV. Like maybe it truly has to be a multi-POV story, and that's okay. Yeah. But be careful so that the reader doesn't feel cheated by multiple POVs, like in a thriller.
Or like step back and do like an omniscient third and approach it as like a narrator describing like the overall scope, and you're not very close with any one character, which I'm not very familiar with omniscient third. I have never written it and I don't read a lot in it, so I don't have a lot of advice.
Definitely, I feel like it's more old-fashioned.
It is.
Third.
Yeah. But the books definitely exist that you can read and like learn from those. Like I mentioned earlier, Philip Pullman and Neil Gaiman are two authors who write often in a third person omniscient, and also a lot of older books.
All right.
Here's an interesting question. Is a YA with a teen and adult point of view a no-no in the publishing industry? A YA, probably yes, but
if you have an adult POV in a YA, congrats, you've written an adult novel that happens to have a teen character.
I was going to say, like, the first thing that I thought of was Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, where the main protagonist of the series is a 16-year-old girl, but the first book, the first character that we meet, the first point of view character, is an older man in his 20s or 30s. And, you know, that makes the book adult. Even though we spend a lot of time with this teenage girl, we have adult points of view as well.
And that's another thing with POV intents and choices, actually, and multi-POVs as well, that really informs like how you approach story and character definitely has an impact on category or genre. But specific to YA, people are always asking, well, what makes a book a YA novel? And actually, I think this is the reason so many of them are told in first person, because a hallmark of YA specifically as a category is closeness and immediacy. And when you get into like kind of third person territory, especially if it's not quite as limited, if it's more omniscient and it's a grander storytelling feel and you're mixing in multiple characters, especially if they're different ages, that's not YA. Grand storytelling field generally doesn't describe that as a category. So that it's tense and POV can make a huge impact on literally what your book is. It's fascinating. Choices.
Yeah, with one of my books, Storyteller, that was something that I kind of struggled with because, you know, it was about a young woman in her early 20s, and you know, she was done with school. She didn't have she wasn't dealing with YA themes, with teen themes, but it was written in first person present and she had a young voice. And one thing that beta readers would say is like, this feels like YA. And I'm like, no, but it's adult. She's an adult. Like it's adult.
Well, this means everyone should listen to our podcast episode on what is YA, because we talked a lot about this. Because oh God, and that's a whole other conversation about the blurring lines in terms of category and writing style. But it does all kind of start with tense and POV, where certain ones just do lend themselves so specifically to a certain category, and there's certain rules.
I mean, that's kind of like what new adult is it's adult romance, not always romance, but adult stories told in a YA tense and style a lot of the time. But yeah, it does play a really big role in like categories and things like that.
Here's another interesting, it's more of a comment than a question, but I like it. Stanislav says, you know, is it just me or does first person present tense often feel very robotic? And I actually think this is something interesting to talk about, to dig into this specifically, because I think first person present tense is a danger zone. I think it very easily does read as very by rote, I think robotic's a great word for it, meaning as a writer, it's easy to fall into the trap of, I do this, I do that, I see this, the filtering, I feel this. I think it's harder to vary your sentence structure and your prose and make the sentences interesting in first person present. It's something I've been really struggling with writing it for the first time for a whole novel. But you can definitely overcome it. The Hunger Games.
Yeah.
But no, it's not just you. This is part of what I'm talking about where, people default to first person, especially for YA, and they barf out a novel, and sometimes those novels do leave something to be desired in the prose.
Yeah, it can get repetitive.
Yeah.
And like I've definitely struggled with exactly what you're saying with first person, where I'm just like, I need to say this character like walks to the front of the room, but like the best
How do
way
I make it interesting?
I walk to the front of the room. Like you have to vary it to be like walking to the front of the room. I make my way. Like get really like creative with like ways that you can put the same sentence that would be probably a little bit easier to deliver in third person. Because
way easier to deliver in third person.
You have a lot more flexibility with like how you can describe a character doing something rather than I.
But then as a writer, that's also part of the challenge. There's a challenge in whatever you choose to write in, to level up your prose, to level up your writing, to make it as good as you possibly can.
I think first person present tense is so hard. Like I can't imagine doing it. So props to you, Alexa.
And Kat.
Yeah, Kat.
No, it is hard. And part of what I did is because I've been reading a ton. I've been consuming thrillers. And when I find a writer who does it really well, I zone in, I like really zoom in on their line level prose to figure out what they're doing. And I've learned a couple of things, some takeaways from this. I guess I can give one of my tiny tips. One thing I observed is if you do too many dialogue tags in first person present tense, I actually find it distracting. It's a reminder that you're in it. It's really awkward, like meaning I think constantly being like, I say is like really awkward. So instead of doing dialogue tags, I personally have been honing in on action tags that demonstrate who has been speaking. I mean, like connecting action tags to my dialogue, and it's helped my scenes flow a lot and feel less awkward.
Interesting. Good to know.
I know. I stole it from another writer. I was reading, it was actually a friend's book, and I was like, wow, I really like this. It's really flowing and I'm feeling it. And so I reread a page. I was like, what is she doing? And that's what she was doing. She had almost no dialogue tags. And I was like, oh, but I still was completely clear on who was speaking and doing everything. She did a really good job. So I copied it.
Because of what the bits of dialogue were attached to.
The action signifiers were very vivid. I still felt like I was there and I was seeing things. It didn't feel hackneyed. She's a good writer. So learn from your friends or famous published authors. Just reread The Hunger Games. It's fine.
All right. Do we have any final things to say? I think we covered everything.
Probably my main thing is that it's important to remember that no one of these is better than the other. That it's really I think it's down to the skill of the writer, ultimately. I think any good writer can make any POV intense work, but also not every POV intense can work for every story. And sometimes in order to tell the story most effectively, you have to get out of your comfort zone and try something different. Yeah. I'd like to see less snobbery against first person, but that's a personal thing.
You're asking for a lot there, Alexa.
I know. And I love third person.
I've never encountered someone that said I don't like reading first person.
It was all over the comments of my recent video. I was a little flummoxed. I was like, really?
Yeah, I saw some of that, and I was like, oh, so many people.
I feel so called out. Okay.
But also at the same time, I also felt that way for a long time. Like, I didn't like first person, specifically.
And in fairness, yeah, I hated first person present for a long time. So samesies. So.
Oh man, I just trust the writer. I'm like, oh, this is what they chose, so I'll just go along for the ride.
Look at you being a good reader. Whatever.
But then I also tend to forget. I can't even think of. If I looked at any of these books behind me, I wouldn't know what tense, what POV they were written in. I really wouldn't know.
It stands out in your mind, usually, for me at least, when you don't necessarily think you like something, but then it works well. Those are the books that I remember, or the ones that are terrible. Like, I just forever remember that Hunger Games is in first person present tense because I was shocked at how much I liked it. Because when I started reading it, I was like, I don't know about this, and then it was great. Another one that really stuck in my craw. Third person present's really rare, but the one that really stuck with me was Defy the Stars by Claudia Gray. Specifically, I'm still not convinced that it's the best choice for Noemi's POVs, but it is the perfect choice for Abel, who is her essentially like an android, and it fit really well for essentially the robot character. The distance was perfect, but the present tense still lended itself to the action and forward momentum of the novel. So it was a good choice.
Okay, I just remembered one. A Number in the Ashes by Sabatier was first person present tense, and I was shocked at how good and flowy it went.
Yeah. I usually remember it based on the scope of the story, honestly. Like, I think about like Laini Taylor's books, and I'm like, well, those, we see so much, that must be third person, even though I can't distinctly remember it being third person, because we do get so close to her characters as well. Or like Maggie Stiefvater's The Raven Boys. Like, that's also in third person, and like is it in third person? It has to be in third person.
Well, I do think it's worth saying, just a note, it's very YA specific. Urban fantasy, like, that is now called contemporary fantasy, whatever you want to call it, is almost always in third person in YA. Specifically YA. The biggest writers in YA write in third person, like Holly Black, Libba Bray, like the big famous ones. And so they almost like created, or Cassie Clare, they created that standard within those subgenres of YA, whereas it's not the standard in YA contemporary, for example.
Yeah, YA contemporary, we definitely see a lot more first person and single narrators as well. Whereas with the urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, we do see more multiple narrators.
And I think that does speak to it, where like fantasy, it is simply the convention with fantasy to write in third person across the board.
Yeah, that's true.
But in YA, you have to work harder to get the immediacy that agents, editors, and readers expect from the category. So, thrillers too. I'm always impressed when a thriller is in third person, but I still feel right in the main character's head, because you need that for tension and suspense in a thriller. You have to feel like you're with the investigator. At least I do. Those are my favorites.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that is going to do it for our live show today. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in. You can subscribe to this channel. Follow us at Novelty Show on Twitter.com. We also had a podcast episode go up last week, and we have one going up soon, about a week. So you can subscribe to us on the podcast platform of your choice. We're on iTunes and
Google Play. We need to figure out Stitcher.
Yeah, we need to figure out Stitcher. And some people have requested Spotify. I didn't even know Spotify did podcasts. So
we should figure that out too. Yeah. And just a tease, the next episode is Writing to the Market. Ooh. Have voted on by our patrons. Which we also
have a Patreon.
We do. And a Discord.
Yep.
We're doing all the things.
Yeah, we're everywhere. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. And we'll see you next time.
Oh. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.